Well, hey, I hope everybody had a great Christmas and that you got everything you wanted, because I didn't. I had one simple request. I just told my wife one thing. I just want one thing. The expanded edition of the complete letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. That's all I wanted. Simple. The letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. You know what she got me? She got me this, they call it the all-in-one monstrosity of a pot. I mean, what am I supposed to do with that? That doesn't work on a smoker. I mean, what do I do with that? So it's okay, though. I don't mind, because I bought my wife the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. So it all works out. So, all right. Yeah, it is that the way it works, yes, at our age, isn't it? So we're wrapping up the Old Testament. We've been in the Old Testament since September. And kind of, it's really part of a Through the Bible series. We're doing a Through the Bible series this entire really year. And the way we've kind of broken it up is that if the Bible were a trilogy of 3 books, book 1 would be the Old Testament, which really just shows that we have the sin disease. It diagnoses the disease. It shows here's how you to live, but we can't do it. We fail. There's something broken inside of us. And then book 2 would be then the cure, which is Jesus comes as the cure, as the antidote to the sin disease. And then book 3 is really a history of the birth of the church and the growth of the church in the book of Acts and the letters of Paul and the others, which is really the treatment for humanity as the cure goes out, as the church takes the gospel to the world. And so this morning we're really wrapping up book 1, and next Sunday we're going to jump into book 2. And I really encourage you, if you have not already jumped into them, we got these supplemental readings. You know, I keep talking about it, but I just want to make sure everybody has a chance to jump in. Monday through Saturday, we'll have scripture readings each day that kind of coincide with the text that we looked at on Sunday. And there's a podcast reflections too from our team, so you can sign up on that at the table out there, or also on our website. So I encourage you to participate in that if you haven't already done so. Now, I said that this is the last message on the Old Testament, but that's not really true. Last week really was the last message looking at the Old Testament kind of drama of history. What we're going to do this morning, though, is kind of look at what happened in between book 1 and book 2. Because there's about 400 years that go by between the end of the Old Testament, book 1, and the beginning of the New Testament, book 2 and book 3, and a lot can happen in 400 years. I mean, just think about our own country. I mean, 400 years ago, it's like the Pilgrims were around, and now, 400 years later, we're arguably the greatest, superpower in the world. We've guided the world through 2 world wars. We landed somebody on the moon. A lot can happen in 400 years. And that's the same is true with Israel. When the Old Testament ends, the Persian Empire is in charge of Israel, controlling Israel. And at the beginning of the New Testament, the Roman Empire is in control. How did that happen? Because the New Testament writers, they don't fill us in. They don't let us know what happened in those 400 years, because for them, it's just recent kind of history. It's part of common knowledge, they assume, but for us 2,000 years later, it's not really common knowledge. So I just want to take us through a brief summary of those 400 years for us, which is going to help us both as a segue from the Old Testament to the New, but also really to set the stage as we dig into the world that Jesus was born into. And now history, I mean, it can be a kind of a dry and lifeless thing, but here's how I'd like us to look at this morning. When Sandy and I started dating, part of that dating process was learning each other's story, learning her history. And so I would ask, where did she go to high school, and what was her past experiences, and learning about her family, and learning about her relatives. Some of that you could say was dry history, but I didn't feel that way because I was falling in love with her. I wanted to learn about her world. And so that's really what we're doing right now this morning. We're learning about Jesus' world, the world into which Jesus was born into. What was that world like, and how did it get that way? So let's do that. Look at these 400 years. We call them the silent years, these 400 years between the Testament, because God did not speak during those centuries through any prophets, didn't come on the scene. There's no sacred scriptures written during those 400 years. But a lot happened in those 400 years. Political changes, cultural, societal changes, and what I'm going to call just spiritual changes as well. So first, with regard to the political changes that happened during this 400 years, toward the end of the Old Testament, what we have is we've got the Babylonian Empire came and destroyed the southern kingdom of Judah, and they took the exiles, a lot of the Jewish population, and exiled them into Babylon in modern-day Iraq over here. And that exile lasted about 70 years. During the course of that 70 years, at some point, the Persian Empire, an even greater empire, swallowed up the Babylonian Empire, and through a King Cyrus of the Persians, allowed many of the Jewish people to go back to their homeland, and including people like Ezra and Nehemiah. They were allowed to go back and rebuild the temple, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And that's pretty much where the Old Testament ends, in that setting. From that point on, the Persian Empire continued to control Israel for about 150 years or so, until a person came on the scene. One of the most fascinating figures of history came on the scene, a guy named Alexander the Great. And he, at the age of 23 years old, in the year 334 BC, started to lead the Greeks and swept through the entire Persian Empire, conquering. And in 10 years, he conquered the entire Persian Empire, and he pushed even farther into India. It was the greatest empire the world had seen at that time. And he did that in 10 years. He was 23 years old when he started that conquest. He was 33 years old when he completed that conquest, and then he had the gall to die. He died very young, and after his death, that kingdom of the Greeks was basically split into 4 kingdoms, divided among 4 of his generals. And one of those kingdoms of the Ptolemies, there in the bottom left, they were the ones that kind of controlled Israel now for about 100 years or so. And they're fairly lenient with the Jewish people. They let them have limited self-rule, let them have their own religion. Alexander the Great, that was his policy too. However, in the course of these 4 kingdoms, there's power struggle, and the Seleucids, they're the yellow there, eventually kind of expanded, and they, after about 100 years or so, took over that governance of what is Israel, and so they controlled for a while, and eventually one of the rulers of the Seleucid Empire came on the scene. His name was Antiochus IV. Now, Antiochus was not that smart a guy, I guess you could say. He decided that, okay, it's time to not be so nice to the Jews. I mean, they're not assimilating into Greek culture. We gotta Hellenize them. We gotta kind of make them Greek. And so he decided it'd be a great idea if we took the temple in Jerusalem and turned it into a temple of Zeus, which he did. And they actually had a Zeus statue in the temple in Jerusalem. Well, he did not really count on the fact that this would be so anathema to the Jewish people, and who are so fiercely, devoted to Yahweh and to monotheism. And this desecration of the temple thing really just stirred the Jewish people to revolt under the leadership of a guy named Judas Maccabees. Actually, his father was a part of it too, and he had a lot of brothers. But Judas the Hammer, he was called. And in 167 BC, he led this revolt, he and his family. And in 165, there's Antiochus IV. And in 165, they liberated the city of Jerusalem from the Greeks. They won their independence. And they cleansed the temple. They got rid of all of the Zeus stuff. They kicked out the Greeks. They cleansed the temple. And that purification of the temple, and they reinstated worship of Yahweh in the temple. That cleansing of the temple in 165, it's still celebrated by Jewish people today. Do you know what that day is called? Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah is, commemorating the day that the Maccabees cleansed the temple and they won independence. And for about 100 years, that family kind of ruled and expanded over time to include most of what is included in Israel in Bible times and today. And so that ruling family became known as the Hasmonean dynasty. Everybody say Hasmonean dynasty. Hasmonean. Aren't you guys smart? You guys are really smart. And so that Hasmonean dynasty led for 100 years or so. But they were never completely secure because the Greek Empire was still powerful, even though it was disintegrating. And there was this up-and-coming empire that was starting to butt up against the Greeks, and that was the Roman Empire. And so for 100 years or so, there's this kind of power struggle between Rome and Greece. Rome, of course, eventually won. And so the Roman Empire then kind of took over control of Judea, of Israel. And as we get closer to the time of Jesus, Caesar Augustus was the Caesar at the time that Jesus was born and really led Rome to about this extent of its empire that continued to grow even more after that too. But as they took over Judea and Israel, what the Hasmonean dynasty kind of collapsed. They kind of fell into disrepute a little bit too, got corrupted a little bit as centuries went on. But what Augustus did, Caesar did, he set up a puppet king, a guy by the name of King Herod. Herod was not a Jew. He was local from the region, but he was actually from Edom. He was descended from Esau. He was an Edomite. But he saw himself as a Jew. In fact, he kind of like to, in order to kind of try to lead the Jews, he kind of took on that identity. He followed the dietary laws, like not eating pork. And so he considered himself a Jew, even though the people of Israel kind of were very suspicious of him. He had some quirks, like he would tend to kill his sons. He was a very paranoid guy. And he was always thinking that his sons were going to overthrow him. And it's like on several occasions he killed this son, and then a little bit later he killed that son. And he was just paranoid guy. In fact, Caesar Augustus, this is true from history. We know there's a quote of Caesar Augustus referring to King Herod, because Herod was known to kill his sons and also to follow the dietary laws of not eating pork. Caesar once said, "I'd rather be his pig than one of his sons." It's safer that way. So in light of that paranoia that we know even from history, it's not hard to believe that when the Magi came to Bethlehem looking for who Jesus who was to be born, that Herod was paranoid that a rival king was going to rise up, and that's why he had, had all children 2 years and under, all male children killed in Bethlehem. That bears out in history based on what we know of King Herod, that he would do such a thing. Now, all that history, you don't really need to remember the details, but those were events that would have been fresh in the minds of Jesus and of Peter and of James and John and Paul and all the rest of the New Testament writers. This was all their recent history. This is what they learned in school growing up. Now, when it comes to the cultural changes or societal changes, there's a lot that happened in those 400 years, but I'm just going to point out two of the most significant ones with regard to the birth of the church and setting the stage for the coming of Jesus and the spread of Christianity. And one of those important changes or cultural things that happened came as a result of the Greek conquest, and the other one came as a result of the Roman conquest. The significant change that happened with regard to the Greek conquest was the spread of the Greek language. As Alexander the Great kind of swept through and kind of absorbed the Persian Empire, and he spread Greek culture as he went, and especially spread the Greek language. And over time, the Greek language really became kind of a universal language. I mean, everybody had their own language, but it became like everybody's second language. Even when the Romans conquered the Greeks, the Romans recognized the civilization of Greece was pretty awesome. And, the poets and the philosophers, they recognize the superiority of some of that. And so they still maintain kind of the Greek language in the Greco-Roman world as kind of a secondary language. Not in Italy so much, they did Latin, but they did in the rest of the world. It really became everybody's second language. So there's really the ability to communicate through a vast area of the Mediterranean world. And that, of course, helped really birth Christianity and set the stage, because when the apostles, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, began to write down the events of what happened in the gospel and basically write the New Testament, they wrote it not in Hebrew, but they wrote it in Greek. In fact, in the street language of Greek, the Koine Greek, meaning that now the New Testament that had been written, sacred scriptures that had been written, could be quickly communicated to people all over the Roman world at that time. But not only that, that's a significant thing in itself. But the other thing that really helped in kind of paving the way and setting the stage for the birth of Christianity was in 275 BC, a group of 70 Jewish scholars got together in Alexandria, Egypt, and they translated the Old Testament into Greek. And that translation is called the Septuagint. And that was significant because now the Greco-Roman world has the ability to read the Old Testament for the first time. And they began to actually do that. I mean, as Jewish communities kind of were spreading all over the Greco-Roman world, the Old Testament was also with them, and people could read it in Greek. And so now you have Greek and Roman and other peoples of that empire reading the Old Testament for the very first time. And they recognize there's something different about this. Many of them recognize that, oh my goodness, this is the real thing. They kind of start to, this is not like our Greek and Roman gods who are so immoral and hard to believe this stuff, but this is the living God. And so there was a number of people who, they weren't quite ready to become Jewish. I think the circumcision thing held them off a little bit there. But they really saw that this was the living God. This is the real God. And they became known as God-fearers. In fact, they were really alongside the Jewish community. And those were a lot of the people, as Paul then took the gospel and the church began to spread, it was like they had already read the Old Testament, and these God-fearers did. And we've been talking about how the whole Old Testament is simply getting ready for Jesus. It's just diagnosing the disease, and so it's preparation for the gospel to come. And so isn't it amazing that God was spreading the law throughout the Greco-Roman world, really diagnosing the disease? Here's this law we're trying to follow. We can't quite do it. Something wrong in the human being. And so then Paul comes with the gospel message. Jesus did it for you, and he is the cure. And so that was the one significant thing that happened as a result of the spread of the Greek language. It really paved the way for the scriptures to go forth in the language that people could read. Now, the other thing that happened during this period was really brought through the Roman conquest, and that is something called the Pax Romana. What does that mean? The Roman peace. And they were brutal. They took away people's liberty and such, but they did bring a degree of stability that the world of that area had not seen, the Western world had not seen up until that time. And they brought a relative peace. I mean, it was a forced peace, but there was stability, and they built this elaborate system of roads. Rome was famous for the Roman roads that they built. And so now, for the first time in history, it was relatively safe and easy to travel from city to city, and that also paved the way, set the stage for the explosive growth of Christianity, because Paul traveled on those roads as he and others spread the good news about Jesus. So those are some significant cultural, societal changes that happened during those 400 years, just setting the stage for the coming of Jesus at, I think, just the right time. In addition to that, though, political changes, cultural, societal changes, were also what I just call spiritual changes, or maybe a spiritual climate was being set. We call these 400 years, again, we call them silent years. And that's because During those centuries, God was prophetically silent. For 400 years, there were no prophet in the land, not until the coming of John the Baptist. For 400 years, there were no miracles to speak of. There's no divinely inspired scriptures written. And you kind of maybe ask, why is that? Why did it seem like God just went dark suddenly for 400 years? And I think part of the answer to that may be what we talked about last week a little bit, that phrase, absence makes the heart grow fonder, that in the absence of God's word speaking in kind of that real-time sense. And there's this yearning that kind of just got built up in the Jewish people. They had the Messiah, the prophecies of Messiah to come have been in clearer and clearer forms given, and you had a lot of the prophetic writings of the time when God's Spirit would be poured on all mankind, and there's an anticipation building as the Old Testament ends, but then there's this period of, I think, absence makes the heart grow fonder kind of thing during those centuries leading up to the coming of Jesus. So I think that was in part happening. But there's something else that has struck me as I've kind of pondered over the years, this intertestamental period is what we call it. What struck me is that though God's activity seems to decrease locally in Israel, among the Jews, it appears to me that God was maybe doing something on a global scale in preparation during those 500 years. It may just be a coincidence of history, or maybe that God was actually doing something. I can't be sure, but it's an interesting thing that I just kind of note that suddenly, just as the Old Testament ends, there comes this prophetic silence in Israel. But in other lands, in other cultures, there almost seems to be other prophetic voices emerging. We'll just call them global lawgivers. Look at some of the people who lived during these 500 years leading up to Jesus. In Greece, there was Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. In India, there was Buddha. In China, there was Confucius. And I'm not saying these were prophets of God. They weren't, but I think there was something that was stirring at this time of history. There were certain ones that were discovering things, reaching out to God, so to speak, trying to discern truth. And I find some interesting things that are in common with these figures and figures like this. One is that each of these figures were ones who called into question the traditional religion of their people. They disbelieved the gods and goddesses. Socrates was actually accused of being an atheist because he disbelieved in the gods and goddesses. Actually, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates all did not believe in the Greek gods and goddesses, but they did believe, just through nature, through their own reason and philosophy, there has to be a God. There has to be an all-supreme God who created everything. They just didn't know who he was. And so that's one kind of interesting thing, that they were all kind of called into question the deficiencies of the religion of the people that they were a part of. Second thing that is just kind of interesting about these significant figures, or that's in common on the global stage at this time, was that none of them really sought to create a religion. None of these figures did. Rather, their teachings in large part came down to presenting a moral code of conduct. Of all of them, Buddha, I guess, is semi-religious, but even Buddha, it was his followers that actually turned him into an object of worship. Buddha would have been cringed if that people were worshiping, the Buddha dolls, statues, and all that. Rather, Buddha's message was basically works righteousness, is what his message was, which is really just the law. And actually, if you read some of the Buddhist scriptures, which we in seminary, remember we read the Dhammapada, which is one of the Buddhist scriptures. It reads like the book of Proverbs. It's just kind of good advice. And so all these individuals, Buddha, Confucius, Socrates, Plato, they presented their people with an ethics for living, a code of conduct, a law. And so what you have happening during these 400 years, I think, is that there really is a spreading of the law or laws on a global scale. And what that looked like, on the one hand, you had the spreading of the law through what we call specific revelation. What that means is that's revelation that is actually by God through inspired people who wrote the scriptures and the law of the Old Testament. And that was being spread globally through the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. And so now that law is going forth, preparing people's heart. The diagnosis of the disease that shows we're broken inside, that we need a cure. But also during that time on the global scene, there is what we call general revelation of those who, as Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, God is, no one's without excuse. God reveals himself in nature and reason, and he's put consciousness in our hearts. And so there's poets and philosophers also being raised up during that time who are seeing the deficiencies of their own religion, of their people, and they're seeing they're getting a little bit of the truth that there's a one true God, but they don't have the full story. But they do kind of land on the fact that there is this code of right conduct that we're to live. There's a standard of right and wrong. They don't know how to fulfill it. They try and they fail, and they don't know what to do with the guilt that comes when they try to fulfill that law. Those ways of living that they know we should live, but we don't. But they know that law exists. And so all of that, I think God was using to really prepare for the coming of the gospel. Because before the gospel can come, which is good news, people have to hear the bad news. You have to know that we need the cure. You have to know that you have this disease of sin and brokenness before you can receive the cure. And so I think during this season, on a global scale in the Roman Empire, even beyond, God was preparing people's hearts for the coming of the gospel. So God was really active in, I think, all of that during those 400 years. So what do we do with this? What does all this mean? Well, at one level, I share this just to help us give context and some things that we'll build upon during the next two seasons of the story, the next two books of the trilogy, as we look into Jesus and the gospel accounts, and as we go into the book of Acts this summer too. But there's also several other, I think, personal lessons that we can also derive from this. And one is that God had and has a strategy. He has always had a strategy for preparing the world for the gospel, and he continues to have a strategy as well. And he has a strategy for Gig Harbor. His heart is for Gig Harbor. And so as we're seeking to reach out to Gig Harbor, our task is to tap into what is God's strategy? What is he doing here? And to tap into that, know that we're not on our own in this. God is at work. And then second, that God's timing is perfect. I mean, had Jesus been born in 400 BC, right at the end of the Old Testament, all these things would not have been prepared. So there's that 400 years of yearning and waiting. What's God doing? Well, he was doing a lot of things, which kind of leads to the third point, that even when it seems God is silent, he's not. He was working. He was still at work. He didn't go dark. He was at working under the hood. Even when it seems like God's silent, he is still working. And then finally, it really is all about Jesus. I mean, not only is all the Old Testament getting things ready for Jesus, God, as the one who is in control of history, is even guiding events and getting things ready for the coming of his Son. And so as we close here, I would just maybe say, take these things and maybe apply them to yourself. Did you know that God has a strategy for you? And for growing you into becoming the creature that he has designed you to be? And did you know that God's timing is perfect? Even when it seems like it's not, what's going on here? It seems like God went dark, but he has a perfect timing. He's doing things, which kind of leads to the next thing. Do you know that even when it seems like God's silent, that God is still working in your life under the hood? He is active. He doesn't go dark. He is at work even when it seems like he's silent. He's working to prepare Jesus to come more and more into your life, more and more into my life, because it really is all about Jesus. It's not about us, it's about him. So why don't we just bow our heads and close our eyes and pray. Jesus, thank you that you did come to the rescue, and you are here right now in this room, and you have come. And I just pray as we kind of close out the year now and just kind of move into the next year, that this would be a year, even in these next months, as we dig into the gospel accounts of Jesus, that you would do a work in our hearts, help us to fall deeper in love with you and discover the power of your word in transforming us and making us become more like you, Jesus. We just pray that you would do this for us, but also for those in Gig Harbor that we would invite, would you come and see? Come and see Jesus. Come and see our Jesus. He is the cure. That we would be eager to spread that word. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.